Hi, my name is Riley Hicks, and I'm a senior at Duke University studying public policy, computer science, and global health. I'm a student in Professor Hoffman's Cybersecurity and National Security Law and Policy class in the Sanford School of Public Policy. Over the course of the semester, we've covered various instances and topics involving cybersecurity, both domestically and abroad. The topic that interests me the most is the relationship between social media and national security. Some of the questions that we have asked over the semester have been: how does social media pose a threat to personal and national security? Who is responsible for regulating and monitoring content on social media? And other questions regarding the implementation of policies that force social media platforms to reduce threatening content. For my capstone project, I've decided to focus on the relationship between social media and national security concerns, specifically through conducting my own research of my peer group, family, and friends. I wanted to investigate the perceived level of threats and opinions on U.S. cyber policy regarding if social media apps should be forced to take down malicious content from foreign nation states or foreign actors on social media platforms. Here's the agenda for my presentation. I'll begin by defining important terms such as social media and national security. Then I will identify the pros and cons of social media. Next, I will recall 4 key events and trends both globally and domestically that have risen the concerns about social media's power to impact national security, in addition to prompting many of my survey questions. Following the events, I will outline how I conducted my research and then provide an analysis of the results. Finally, I will conclude my presentation by sharing 2 policy recommendations I propose for how we should be moving forward given the concerns shared from the survey. One being a workshop hosted by the Department of Homeland Security on social media transparency, and 2, the addition of a good faith requirement as an amendment to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. There are 2 definitions I want to clarify for complete understanding throughout the presentation: social media and national security. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, social media encompasses, quote, websites and applications that enable users to create and share content or to participate in social networking, end quote. The national security is described as, quote, the duty of the government to provide defense and security to the citizens, economy, and institutions of a sovereign state, end quote. Social media came out of the Web 2.0 revolution and was the jumping off point for features and applications that allow individuals to connect online and share information. There are 7 popular social media applications that are widely used today. Some were created back in 2004, such as Facebook, and some were created more recently in 2017, such as TikTok. It is important to note that all of these platforms are US-based except for TikTok, which is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. Social media has changed the way that we communicate with one another, allowing us to exchange information, videos, and photos in a matter of seconds across continents. There are both pros and cons to social media, and it is essential that we are aware of the risks that come with its rewards. Some pros to social media are connectedness, community, immediate spread of information, no-cost usage, encouragement of political or social advocacy, and overall convenience of access. However, for every pro, there is a con. The Department of National Counterintelligence and Security Center warns against social media usage, stating that, quote, hostile actors routinely pose as headhunters, interested employers, or people with enticing career opportunities in order to connect and develop relationships with people who have access to valuable information, end quote. Foreign intelligence agencies are not only targeting government employees for information via social media, but also private sector individuals are being targeted for information. Some of the cons using social media include cyberbullying, spread of misinformation, privacy risks, trolling, hacking, and stalking, among other concerns. To illustrate the intensity and impact of social media, I chose 4 examples of events or groups that convey the importance of this topic and influence. Given each of these events, their cybersecurity implications led me to ask certain questions in my survey regarding national security and social media. The first event I chose to highlight is the 2011 UK riots. Following the murder of Mark Duggan by London police, triggered riots in different areas of London. The Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, announced that the riots were organized via social media and pose a huge threat to national security. News headlines stated that many of the riots incited were organized by the latest technology of teenage gang members communicating via mobile phones such as BlackBerries. BlackBerry Messenger was used to plan 2 nights of looting, and social media was used to bring together the 200-person mob that was rioting. All claims that social media was the reason that the rioting came about was explained by both left and right-wing political outlets. The Prime Minister at the time said that the only way to stop the rioting would be to ban rioters from using social media and shutting down BlackBerry Messenger. However, this had some concerns about its infringement on personal freedoms and freedom of speech. However, this tactic was deemed both useless and unrealistic. Also, there were some positive outcomes of the social media on the riots, such as the hashtag Riot Cleanup that got people together to clean up the streets after the riots. Study conducted that the riots were not the product of the technology itself, but, quote, they are the effects of a structural violence of neoliberalism, end quote. The Prime Minister's idea of banning rioters from social media led me to wonder about how U.S. citizens would react to such events, and if individuals feel that the U.S. as a nation should be doing anything to prevent the harms of social media, in addition to if those prevention methods would infringe on personal freedoms, such as freedom of speech. I will discuss the results from the survey questions later on in the presentation, so stay tuned. Besides being just a platform for sharing and liking posts amongst your friends and family, social media has become a space where people can, quote, globally organize revolutions and riots, recruit terrorists, encourage attacks, glorify gangs, and spread violence, end quote. Identified terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and other extreme right-wing groups use the internet to spread propaganda about their ideology and attacks. They distribute training guides and recruit others online. Videos on YouTube, such as videos that include how to make bombs and how to distribute them, are present on the internet. Cyberspace today allows these actors to extend their power in the social media domain at a scale and complexity which was impossible earlier on in generations. In order to combat this issue, the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs recommends targeting the producers of the content on social media rather than the consumers. This is different from the UK Prime Minister in 2011. This is in addition to community education on the practices of being safe online and on social media platforms. This led me to wonder about how safe individuals really feel online, which is why I asked one of the questions in my survey about whether or not individuals feel safe using certain apps on social media, and the results were very interesting. The third event is the tweet from the Associated Press account during the Obama administration in 2013. The Twitter account of Associated Press released a tweet falsely stating that there had been 2 explosions at the White House, resulting in an injury to President Obama. Within 2 minutes, the tweet had reached the U.S. stock traders and dropped it over 143 points. The loss was estimated around $136.5 billion. The misinformation and possible hacking of a Twitter account resulted in financial harm and likely incited fear within U.S. citizens. National security was at risk given the influence that social media hacking had on the economy and its detrimental effects to the reputation of Associated Press as a reliable news source. This event led me to want to survey people on whether or where they gather their information from on social media, which ended up being online news outlets and on Twitter. The final example is Cambridge Analytica. They misused 50 million Facebook users' personal data and information with the goal of helping U.S. conservative candidates in the 2016 election, such as Ted Cruz and later Donald Trump. Cambridge Analytica gave the candidates full profiles on Democratic voters, including a psychological profile to then tailor campaign pitches for individual people. The full profiles included polling information, voting records, and online activity. The actions of Cambridge Analytica followed Facebook data usage rules, which at the time allowed the app to take information about all users and, even more importantly, information about their friends. That data included education, location, the groups and the pages that they liked, their relationship status, and where they worked. This shows the dangers within the social media platform policies themselves that allow dangerous actors, domestic or foreign, to interfere and bypass certain securities or regulations of personal information. Because of this concerning event, I wondered if individuals knew about certain entities gathering personal information and whether or not they were okay with it. I will discuss the results of this question in my survey later on in the presentation. Given the background and knowledge of social media and its national security implications, I will now pose a couple of research questions that guided my research in the first place. The first question is, what is the relationship between social media and national security? The second question I want to highlight is, what should the U.S. do to keep citizens safe? And more generally, what are some current policies and how can we improve or enforce new policies? And are they effective, and do people actually care? I conducted research in finding the answers to the two research questions by distributing a Qualtrics survey. The 18-question Qualtrics survey was sent to my peers, friends, and families to collect shorter, more concise responses on general usage of apps and knowledge of data collection. I received a total of 76 surveys. I asked questions for people to select what apps they used and identify the frequency of usage, whether or not they knew about their data being collected, and if they were concerned about personal and national security while using those apps. I also asked questions to incite a different response about policy, like if social media apps should be responsible for taking down content, and if there should be stricter regulations on social media policies. After looking over the results, I aggregated the data into various visualizations to display. I broke up the results into 6 categories: demographics, apps and frequency of use, voting information, awareness and regulation, personal and national security, and other comments. I'll begin by talking about the types of people that responded to my survey. Almost 82% of the respondents were in the 18 to 25 age range, which makes sense given that most of my contacts are my age. The next largest respondent group fell into the 26 to 35 age range at 12.7% of the respondents. The majority of respondents are from either the undergraduate or graduate program here at Duke, which I am also not surprised about given my peer group and classmates. In terms of the apps used by respondents, I'm also not surprised that 93% of people have used Instagram in the past year, but slightly surprised that only 55% of respondents have used TikTok in the past year, given its extreme popularity. In addition, the majority of people, at 51 respondents, said they use social media multiple times a day, which also didn't surprise me given that it's sometimes necessary for keeping up with the latest trends and news. However, the results of this question responded to my surprise about TikTok usage in the last slide. When I asked if people didn't use a certain app because they were concerned about their personal information or safety on the app, TikTok was the most popular response. It now makes sense why only 52.54% of respondents said they have used TikTok in the past year, because they are concerned by the platform's ability to collect their personal information. Another interesting response in the survey was where people got their information for voting from. Again, I'm not surprised that 93% of respondents clicked on the online news source as one of the places where they get their information from. However, this shows that the focus of the spread of misinformation is online and most prevalent in online news sources, given this is where people are getting their political information from. I then asked questions about the general awareness of foreign nation states' presence online and if there should be stricter regulations for social media platforms, and the results were similar across the three questions. The first question asked about the awareness, of which 71% of respondents said they were aware of foreign presence on social media. The second question regards if social media platforms should be obligated to take down content from malicious foreign actors, and slightly less, 66% of respondents said they should. And again, similar to the first question, 72% of respondents said there should be overall stricter regulations for social media companies. Now here's where it gets a little more nuanced. One of the questions in my survey asked, are you concerned about the violation of the First Amendment if there are stricter regulations on social media? 46% said yes, and 54% said no. It is interesting to see that the younger generation is more concerned with their First Amendment rights than the older population is, inferring from the results from my survey. I guess that makes sense given Gen Z's character of being supportive of free speech and how we are unafraid to voice our opinions on the internet. Additionally, another interesting facet of my research was from the survey question asking if foreign nation states present a threat to both personal security and national security. The results found that the respondents were more concerned about national security than they were about their own, which is surprising to me that both of these questions were so different in their responses. It is interesting to find that a higher percentage of people are concerned about national security than they are about the potential violation of the First Amendment. I would guess that this pool of respondents would, in the majority, be okay with legislation that perhaps limited the First Amendment as a result of increasing national security. The most common concern, as demonstrated by the survey, was the spread of misinformation on the internet. We will dive deeper into this concern in one of my recommendations later on in the presentation. About 76% of respondents checked it as one of their top concerns, so this means that the majority of people seem to be concerned about misinformation online. Finally, I left a space for respondents to say anything they wanted to add in longer form. Some people said that if there are regulations imposed by foreign nation states, then there should also be regulations in the United States. Others alluded to Trump's election, saying that social media was the reason why Trump got elected, and if there had been stricter regulation on social media such as Facebook, maybe he wouldn't have been in office. This shows the power of social media and perception on its impact. There were three main takeaways I found to be most salient from collecting and analyzing the survey results. National security is more of a concern than First Amendment rights. Misinformation and disinformation are main concerns when using social media. And there should be stricter regulation of social media with a focus on TikTok. So where do we go from here? I have two recommendations that address the main concerns of my respondents, extended to the opinions of the broader public. My first recommendation is a workshop on transparency policies for social media platforms. And my second recommendation is the amendment of a good faith requirement to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Given that the results of the survey concerned the spread of disinformation and agreed for a stricter regulation of social media, requiring a level of transparency can be the first step into stricter regulation and one way to combat disinformation on the internet. The goal of the workshop is to analyze current state and federal social media policies and, more specifically, encourage the adoption of California's newest transparency bill. On September 27, 2022, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 587, a social media transparency measure that requires social media companies to, quote, publicly post their policies regarding hate speech, disinformation, harassment, and extremism on their platforms and report data on their enforcement of the policies, end quote. Assembly member Gabriel, who heavily advocated for the signing, shared that, quote, this new law will finally pull back the curtain and require tech companies to provide meaningful transparency into how they are shaping our public discourse, as well as the role of social media in promoting hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and other dangerous content. The workshop would be an opportunity for government stakeholders and representatives to understand the impact of the new measure and how it can be adopted across states. The workshop should occur twice a year, once in January and once in July, in order to keep up to date with the technological innovation and other developments. The workshop should be hosted by the Department of Homeland Security, given the concern for national security that was expressed in the survey. The attendees should be members of the Department of Homeland Security and state governors. More specifically, within the DHS, Assistant Attorney General for the National Security should be present. Also within the DHS, members of CISA, such as the Deputy Director, the Cyber Safety Review Board, which includes private and public sector stakeholders, the Undersecretary Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans, and his Assistant Secretary for Cyber, Infrastructure, Risk, and Resilience. All should be present at the workshop to fully flesh out and analyze current social media policies, risks, and potential next steps for combating misinformation and safety on social media. My second recommendation is an amendment to the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. There have been ongoing debates considering changing this Section 230 of the CDA, but there hasn't been consensus on what to do: repeal, amend, or limit the scope with new legislation. For instance, in the 116th Congress, there have been 25 bills introduced by lawmakers to amend or repeal Section 230 and over 20 proposals to reform it. To address the concerns of the spread of both misinformation and disinformation expressed in the survey, and the general need for stricter regulation or accountability of social media platforms, I recommend an amendment to Section 230 focusing on language such as adding the good faith requirement that limits the immunity provided by the section to bad actors. In addition, the increase in internet use also reflects the need for constant change to this section. In 1995, the year Section 230 was drafted, Pew Research Center found that only 21% of Americans had been using the World Wide Web. And 26 years later, in 2021, 93% of Americans told Pew that they used the internet. To walk you through my next recommendation, I will begin by describing the current state of Section 230, then I will discuss an example of a court case that prompted the discussion of the amendment to the section, and then go into greater detail about the recommendation itself. The current section of 230 of the CDA is this. Enacted in 1996, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act helps protect online companies from liability arising from what is posted on their platforms. There are concerns of vague language and innovation in technology and the addition of cloud services. Section 230 shields websites from civil liability for content that they choose to allow on their platforms. But the statute also establishes that they may not be held liable for taking content down either. In doing so, it removes the legal risks of moderation, i.e., Platforms may take down what they like without worrying about exposing themselves to lawsuits. An example of the lack of liability that social media platforms have been held to in the past, I will describe the court case Gonzalez versus Google to illustrate the power of Section 230 and its lack of ability to identify and punish malicious activity online. Gonzalez, a California State University student who, while studying abroad in Paris, was killed in the 2015 ISIS shootings, along with 128 other people. There was a lawsuit filed against Google saying that Google's subsidiary, YouTube, hosted ISIS content on its platform, violating the Anti-Terrorism Act. Using YouTube's targeted recommendations feature to target users who, based on their online activity, were more likely to be radicalized. Using Section 230, last year, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit rejected this argument. Section 230 doesn't apply to the amplification of the content, only the development of the content, which Google was technically not involved in. This is problematic because Section 230 protected Google from being responsible for the content hosted on its site, which in turn caused the death of Gonzalez and 128 other individuals. The amendment would be specifically creating a good faith requirement for Section 230 of the CDA. The wording suggested by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation is, quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service, acting in good faith, shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." This addresses the problem of bad actors benefiting from the immunity of Section 230. Good faith can be defined as, quote, "honesty in a person's conduct during the agreement," end quote. So in this context, social media companies are being honest in their judgment and moderation of taking down harmful content on their platforms. They're being held responsible for acting in good faith, aka being good and honest in their decisions regarding content online. The Department of Justice supports the implementation of a good faith requirement and defines that it will, quote, "limit immunity for content moderation decisions to those done in accordance with the plain and particular terms of service and accompanied by a reasonable explanation, unless such notice would impede law enforcement or risk imminent harm to others," end quote. I will describe an example of how the good faith requirement will help illustrate how companies will no longer be protected from being liable for malicious online decisions. A court finds that a social media platform, such as Instagram, deliberately fails to enforce its existing terms of service regarding unlawful content, and they are using algorithmic recommendations to enforce the harmful content on their users. This example would not be acting in good faith, and the amendment can be used to hold Instagram liable for their actions. In addition, this amendment could have been used in the lawsuit against Google, where they didn't prohibit ISIS's unlawful content on YouTube, but they actually advertised it. Under the Section 230 with the good faith requirement, Google would have been punished for being liable for hosting and promoting harmful videos on their platform and would proceed with further caution and hopeful regulation in the future. My research resulted in 2 pain points that needed to be addressed from a policy standpoint: the accountability and transparency of social media companies, and the concern for national security, which can be seen through the lack of transparency in social media policies and therefore the ability for policy to hold them accountable for promoting dangerous content. To combat these issues and concerns, I recommended 2 things. The first was for the Department of Homeland Security to hold a workshop on social media transparency twice a year, focusing on the adoption of California's new transparency law to take the first step into holding companies accountable for the spread of misinformation and disinformation and other harmful content. The second recommendation was to amend the highly contested Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act with a good faith requirement to strengthen the ability for courts to punish social media companies who aren't acting in good faith. This will help increase the protection of companies acting in good faith and reduce the risk of bad actors being protected by the Act. Overall, it is imperative that we analyze our current social media policies and constantly amend legislation to keep up with the ever-changing world of technology and innovation. To protect our country's citizens online, we must take a closer look at what social media companies need to be required to do, and if they are acting in bad faith, punish them for harmful and potentially detrimental behaviors that put citizens and national security at risk. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.